Speaking about, what's happening in the global political economy right now, what's happening in the Middle East as it relates to China as well as the U.S. But before we get into Iran, I just want to start with, do you think that there will be a decoupling of U.S.-China relations, or do you think that we will still cooperate and have strategic stability between the two countries?
The United States needs to be very careful because, as we discussed in this call, and we've discussed in many other calls, the United States is very dependent on China for its manufacturing supply chain. And so I think that China doesn't want to just be kind of muscled and maneuvered by the United States. I think it wants to be, if somebody in the Trump administration, whether it was President Trump or Peter Navarro were calling me, I would say, pay your respects. We need each other. And this is what I think that the Chinese government wants, is they want to be respected.
We don't see China interfering and intervening, but that's one big difference between the U.S. and China. What do you think the impact is on the economy by not getting involved in those conflicts?
So I just want to do, not a corrective, but just a little bit of a nuance on what you're saying.
Yeah.
Because yes, it's true that the United States has been a much more aggressive involvement in a lot of diplomatic situations, and we've seen very extreme versions of this with Venezuela and with Iran. And that being said, China has a more subtle involvement approach, right? And
I'm thinking back to Trump heading to have conversations with Chairman Xi. China says thorough preparations are needed. What do you think those conversations are going to be like when they finally do sit down and talk?
In China, I think the issues are much more driven by the sort of these three tiers that we often talk about, right? So there's the central government, which is China in Beijing, and President Xi and some of the major economic advisors that our team talks to, but are kind of keys to thinking about the strategy for China is. And then there's...
So does your advice change at all for businesses looking to build relationships in China, build supply chain, build manufacturing support systems? Has anything changed in the last couple weeks about how you might counsel some of your business clients?
Well, I mean, I love the question, Aubrey, and I'll take sort of two levels of thinking about this. One is the big clients that I've had, organizations like Apple. Again, these organizations are married. Now, the second part of this is for smaller organizations, China's a huge opportunity, right? And so one of
Hi, Doug. How are you?
Hey, Aubrey, so good to see you. It's always such an enjoyable moment in my weeks to be able to talk about China with you and to just get to share ideas with you. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And I also, from my angle, I appreciate our conversations because it, forces my gaze beyond my own town, my own family, and, causes me to think more globally. So I appreciate being pulled out of my own little bubble because I know that I'm impacted by the broader world. I just don't always think about it as I'm going about my day. I'm not forced to think about it like, some folks are right now in Iran, or our soldiers who have gone over there, they're living this every day. So I, get to be in my safe bubble. And so I appreciate being pulled out of it every now and then and thinking about what's happening in the rest of the world. So well, speaking about, what's happening in the global political economy right now, I know that the team is paying close attention to, of course, everything China, what's happening in the Middle East as it relates to China as well as the U.S. But before we get into Iran, I just want to start with, sort of the bigger picture. I know that over the past few years, there's a lot of conversations about decoupling between U.S. and China. The tariff war was, a big, kind of challenge between the two countries and may still continue to be challenging. But is this we've talked about this before as, U.S. and China being like the G2. Do you think that there will be a decoupling of U.S.-China relations, or do you think that we will still cooperate and have, strategic stability between the two countries?
So it's a great question, Aubrey. I have said to you many times, and I've said to our audiences many times, we're married to China. there is no way that we are diverging because companies like Apple, Tesla, Walmart, and many others are so fundamentally tied to China that I can't imagine decoupling, right? And so, sometimes people, my listeners and the people I write to, get very nervous when I say things like we're married to China and there's no divergence here. And I do fundamentally believe that's true, Aubrey, except current global geopolitical issues, I think, challenge this a little bit. And so I think that's what we're going to talk about today. And it's a really interesting moment. I think our economies are so deeply tied together. You know, Apple is the most profitable and most valuable company in the world because of its relationship with China. And if China's decided, okay, we're decoupling, that's going to mean Apple, Tesla, and Walmart and many other companies are all out of China. It's going to be a disaster for the U.S. economy, and it's going to be a disaster for the global political economy. So I
Right.
don't think that that's going to happen, but things are getting tense. There's a lot of interesting geopolitical issues here. So just to answer
Well,
your
let's get
question,
into that.
yeah, just
Hmm.
to answer your question, I think we're still married, but stuff is getting
Yeah, yeah,
tense.
yeah. So at the end of February, on February 28th, so, our colleagues in China were still celebrating the Lunar New Year. The United States and Israel launched a major attack against Iran. They killed the supreme leader and other military officials. That's huge. And then, of course, Iran retaliated, striking a lot of targets, which raised concerns about the global energy market and shipping lanes. This obviously is going to have a lot of an impact on the global politics, the oil trade, as well as how China and the U.S. relate to one another, as there's different levels of involvement with the two countries in Iran. It seems interesting that the reaction in China is different than what we've seen from other countries. And so how are we interpreting China's reaction to the US and Israeli attacks on Iran?
So, again, this is I don't want to say great question in the sense of like, this is exciting thinking about U.S. China relations and economic development. This is a scary moment. But I love the question because, as experts on U.S. China relations, we need to be thinking about these issues. I'm not an expert on Iran. And so I want to just be careful in citing people. Recently, I listened to a podcast by Haviv Rittiger, and I thought it was brilliant. And he sort of laid out a lot of the issues that I really need to understand, and we really need to understand in terms of thinking about U.S.-China relations. So on the one hand, we're the experts in U.S.-China relations, but like there is, a whole thing going on with Iran. And so we need to think about this. His positioning was very much around the idea that, um, you know, his basic statement was, and I'm going to quote him here, China was investing in turning Iran into a state that could disrupt American military at the strategic scale. China today is Iran's lifeline. 90% of Iran's energy exports go to China. Wow. Wow. Okay. And so again, thinking about this in terms of geopolitical relations, we have U.S.-China relations and all of the issues of the important dynamics about global trade. And, we've discussed many times China's magnificent manufacturing supply chain, et cetera. China is also a global player. It's the number 2 largest economy in the world, and it wants to be considered as a major geopolitical player in the global system. Now, we've also discussed before that China thinks it's a very diminutive position, that there's the G7 and the G20, and China is part of the G20. Now, in September of 2025, when President Trump went to visit Xi Jinping, Chairman Xi in South Korea, he labeled that meeting as a meeting of the G2. And so, like, the idea was, like, we are the 2 most powerful nations in the world. We're going to be doing this. But there's still a positioning that China is not it, right? They're not a part of the G7. And so I think that this kind of, political maneuvering in the Middle East is it matters a lot. And
Mhm.
so the fact that President Trump made this decision to attack Iran, it may just be about Iran and nuclear weapons, but it's probably not. It's probably also about a push and pull with China. And so I just think
Yeah.
there's a lot going on here.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Obviously, you cited the amount of export of oil that's going to China and being, roughly 90%. I saw other sources that said 80%, but that's a large portion of Iran's economy that is reliant on the purchase from China. Obviously, China is not as dependent on Iranian oil, with like 11 to 13% of imports being from Iran. So it's not necessarily like a big threat to China in terms of the energy landscape. But if we're looking at this as a Middle Eastern conflict and not just a Iranian U.S. Israeli conflict, then when we expand that, then there is, I was looking at one source where, you tally up Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, that roughly like 47, so almost half of the import of oil into China is coming from the Middle East. Very small percentage coming from the US, very small percentage coming from Venezuela, maybe 20% coming from Russia. So, in terms of energy supply, this could, if it expands, which we all hope it doesn't, if it does expand, it could threaten China's economy, but they're also increasingly becoming less dependent on oil. So just thoughts on that in terms of like longer term China's reliance on oil, as well as China's reliance on foreign countries for their energy needs.
Well, so it's a great question, and I love the framing of the question. I want to just call out one footnote into what you said, because you noted the dependence on the Middle East, but there's also 20% from Russia. So like there is a a geopolitical process that's going on here that has not just to do with trade, but it has to do with reliance on energy. And China's playing its cards. And I think that's the thing that's really interesting here, is that Chairman Xi does not want to be seen as just a patsy to the United States. Like, he's playing his cards as a global leader also, right? And so and this is what I think is so interesting about the Iran situation and the Iran question, is that, this isn't just about geopolitical dynamics in Russia, China, and the United States. This is also about China playing cards that are about energy and control, but they're playing cards in the Middle East also. And
Mhm.
it's a really interesting moment. And again, I'm more of an economist than a political scientist, but watching this happen and thinking about how the political economics of this and the economics map onto each other is fascinating. I mean, it's fascinating in a good and a bad way. I mean, it's
Prior to this, I was thinking about, the fact that, the US, as a matter of as a matter of course, get involved in other countries' conflicts. We get involved in other countries' politics. And I was thinking about the difference between just what I see, the difference between China and the US. China could be doing the same thing, but they are choosing not to. This was just something I was thinking about and noticing, the fact that China doesn't get involved, and it's part of their overall strategy as a country. And since 1979, they don't get involved with boots on the ground troops in other countries. They may get involved by, supplying technology or weapons. I'm not quite sure what all happens, behind the scenes and then in the support of other countries' efforts. But yeah, I was curious about that and why, we don't see China interfering and intervening. But that's one big difference between the US and China. What do you think the impact is on the economy by not getting involved in those conflicts?
so. I just want to do not a corrective, but just a little bit of a nuance on what you're
Sure.
saying,
Yeah.
because yes, it's true that the United States has been a much more aggressive involvement in a lot of diplomatic situations, and we've seen very extreme versions of this with Venezuela and with Iran. And that being said, China has a more subtle involvement approach, right? And so we've had the conversations about this before, but remember, the development of the BRICS economy, right? So Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and then about a year ago, 9 other smaller countries got involved with BRICS. And then also remember the Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative is fundamentally changing the global political economy because China is shifting its position in terms of being a leader of Asia to a leader of what they call the global South. And so there's a huge thing that's happening here. Now, China has been much more reluctant to adopt the U.S. standpoint or the Russian standpoint, by the way, of, thinking about just aggressive military involvement or aggressive military support. But economically, they are positioning themselves to be the leaders of the global South and leaders of the BRICS economy, right? And so those two things are fundamental. So that's my nuanced pitch. The second thing that's really important here, though, is to your point, while the U.S. has taken a very strong arm approach to kind of governing and sort of controlling and doing things that are very extreme, in my opinion, in places like Venezuela and Iran, China has been doing it subtly. They've been doing it subtly and economically. And so I think that there is a strong approach to being a leader in the global political economy, but it's just not as militaristic as the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. And as I, kind of learn about the sort of the differences between the U.S. and China and how each country is governed and operated, it does seem that China has a much more measured, calculated, long-term view of its economy and its position in the world, and they're a bit more cautious. And perhaps that has to do with our election cycles and how we just don't have time to be long-term and strategic because we've got to win an election in 4 years, where there's a much different scenario happening in China.
I love that framing. And Aubrey, like you and I have been talking about China for the last several months, but yes, I mean, that is China's long-term view is that, for thousands of years, we were the most powerful economy in the world. And then we had a downfall in the Qing dynasty and the Opium Wars and the Sino-Japanese War. And, and then whatever happened with communism, whether that was a downfall or just it was a sort of low burrowing. But since 1979, China's position has been, we're coming back. But it's a more gradual approach and it's less militaristic than the United States approach. It's much more economically driven.
Yeah, something I'm going to research after this call is, the percentage of the U.S. economy that's dependent on defense and military, and then the percentage of the Chinese economy that is related to defense and military. And I would guess that the Chinese percentage is going to be much lower. I don't know this off the top of my head, but I'm wondering how much our intervention in other countries might be impacting our economy in general.
It's a great question, and I love that as a topic for a future conversation.
Yeah, I need to research that. So we talk a lot about, the Chinese supply chain and, the supply chain between the U.S. and China. So just going back to the Middle East and the conflict in Iran, how do you see what's happening impacting? I know we talked about energy and oil, but, impacting the supply chain in China. Do you think anything, I guess, what do you think the ramifications are on the Chinese economy?
Well, it's a great question. And so I would just raise two key issues. One is that there is, and we've discussed this already, but will raise it again. There is a very, very clear connection to and dependence on the Middle East for energy, right? And so China has control over other resources and lots of sources of energy. But, the fact that China is dependent on the Middle East and Iran in particular for oil matters, right? And so, I mean, this is the world's second largest economy, and it's a very powerful economy. The world's largest economies need energy resources, right? And so,
Yes.
so that matters, right? Now, that being said, I think of this conversation that we're having and this situation that we're talking about as much more about political strategy and political strategic maneuvers than it is about just the fact that China needs oil from Iran, right? Iran is more dependent on China than China is on Iran, right? Like China has lots of sources of oil, and it's an important thing that the world global economy depends on. But China is, as we've discussed, it's the world's most sophisticated manufacturing supply chain. And what I view this circumstance with, the Middle East is right now is really about political maneuvering and the extent to which China is not going to be just controlled by the United States. The United States needs to be very careful because, as we discussed in this call, and we've discussed in many other calls, the United States is very dependent on China for its manufacturing supply chain. And so I think that China doesn't want to just be kind of muscled and maneuvered by the United States. I think it wants to be also a player in the geopolitical conversation. And so here's the thing that I think is most interesting, Aubrey, about this is, again, going back to this conversation about the G2 in September of 2025 and, questions about, I mean, President Trump is going to visit Chairman Xi in a couple of months, 1 month.
Yeah.
I think there's going to be a real question of like, are we friends, partners, or do you want to fight with us? And I think the answer is going to be we're friends and partners, that Chairman Xi needs to be respected. If somebody in the Trump administration, whether it was President Trump or Peter Navarro, were calling me, I would say, pay your respects. We need each other. And this is what I think that the Chinese government wants, is they want to be respected.
So looking to U.S.-China relations and how, each country is communicating, we've obviously got this meeting coming up in a month between the leaders of the U.S. and China. But looking back to the evening of February 20, the Chinese Foreign Ministry issued a travel advisory urging its citizens to avoid Iran. So how would they know that there was going to be an attack on February 28th? So the conclusion is, okay, there's going to be something happening. So obviously communication channels are open enough. What do you think that means, that China was giving its citizens a heads up the night before the attack happened?
Well, it's a great question, Aubrey. And the good news is, I think that that's a positive signal, because it means that there is communication going on between China and the United States. And so, like, rather than it being a negative thing about, like, a travel signal or, a statement about, catastrophic things happening, I think basically what it means is that there are people inside the U.S. government and inside the Chinese government that are talking to each other. And to me, that's a good thing. I want us to be talking to each other, and I want us to be treating each other like partners, because we are, right? Again, or even if we have conflicts between political ideologies and conflicts about, how we're operating and who's controlling what, we're still deeply intertwined economically. And so to me, it's better that we're treating each other like partners, and somebody in the United States government is talking to somebody in the Chinese government, and then China is sending out a travel signal.
Right.
Right. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. And I'm thinking back to Trump heading to have conversations with Chairman Xi, and how all of this will impact those conversations. And I think the interesting in the headlines is that, China says like thorough preparations are needed. So obviously that's a signal that we have to think about what you've done, US, right? What do you think those conversations are going to be like when they finally do sit down in a month?
It's a great question, because I feel like I'm a better analyzer and understander of how people negotiate things in China than I am of President Trump. And so I feel like, on the one hand, the U.S. government and President Trump are sort of big on the big moments and love to like have a lot of big highlight issues. In China, I think the issues are much more driven by the sort of these three tiers that we often talk about, right? So there's the central government, which is China and Beijing, and, President Xi, and, some of the major economic advisors that our team talks to, but are kind of keys to thinking about, what the strategy for China is. And then there's the second and third tier cities, which are also really important. And China has, our notion of local governments as industrial firms, Andy Walder's famous article from 1995. And then there's a third level, which is sort of the associations of how to think about China's going global efforts, right? And so my sense is that China thinks about these things in these different tiers, and Chairman Xi is much more careful than President Trump about like kind of mapping out these different tiers. President Trump, I think, wants big moments. Like, forgive me, I'm an American citizen, and I don't mean to criticize our president, but like, I just think he seems to want big moments that name things like the G2, or, we're doing this, or, we're collaborating with China on, the Middle East. But I think that they're much more high profile CNN type moments than they are with Chairman Xi, because I think he thinks much more carefully about like these different levels of economic development.
Mhm.
So I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. It also, the way the way my brain works is I take these big complex issues and I tend to want to reduce it down to something I can understand. And as you're talking, I'm thinking of, just like a relationship between two people, and the relationship where, one partner gives consistent, steady support. That's going to be a healthier relationship than the relationship where it's all just grand gestures. Oh, here's some flowers, but I'm not going to help you clean the kitchen, you know? Like things like that. And it just seems the approach of, slow and steady wins the race, tortoise and the hare, right? I
Right.
mean,
Right.
that feels like, China is working to build a strong economy, and the United States is working to, yeah, dominate headlines or control the markets short term. And yeah, I see the value in that strategic long-term thinking over the bombast and the big moments, like you said.
And can I just push a little bit on what you just said? Because it's not just delivering flowers and having grand gestures. Sometimes this is Venezuela and Iran. Like,
Yeah, it's
it,
slamming the door after an argument, rather than
yeah,
the repair.
right. No, you're right. And to your point, and this is, as the longtime China scholar who has been so bullish on the China economy, but like, yeah, slow and steady. I think your framing of this is 100% right, Aubrey. Slow and steady wins the race, and that's what they believe.
So, question about, we've been talking a lot about, the other countries of the world that aren't the US and that aren't China, and how they're relating, with the US and China. We've seen, we've talked a lot about, the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's speech, where, he's essentially seeming to say, like, hey, US, we're going to separate from you because we can't trust you. We're going to build relationships with China. We've had a long-term relationship. There's a significant portion of our country that speaks Mandarin. We've had this long-term relationship. We're gonna develop our relationship with China, because we can't be, as the U.S., we can't be trusted, and other countries are doing this too. So there seems to be this wave of countries coming out saying we need stability as nations, and we will strategically build relationships with stable countries like China. Right now, there's, I'm wondering how the current conflict and the current need for the US and China to kind of come to this, I think you mentioned, as like a tactical truce. Like, how are these conversations going to go? And are we going to cut out those other countries that are working to build relationships with China? Are we going to make that difficult for them with what's happening right now? I'm just curious to hear your feedback on.
So it's a great question, and here again, I would say that it would it would undermine our interests if we tried to cut China out of its leadership role in the country level relationships that it's building. So, China has taken a position that it's going to be the leader of the global South. It's taken a new position in the building of the BRICS economy. It's taken a new position in the Belt and Road Initiative. And, we have in some ways undercut our own positions on this, right? I mean, so under President Trump and Elon Musk, we cut out a lot of our economic interests in places like Africa, right? We cut out USAID. And guess who is stepping into that void? That would be a little country called China. China is actually investing aggressively through BRICS and through the Belt and Road Initiative in basically filling all of the voids that have been left by the Americans cutting out USAID, right? And so we've done that. That's our decision. And, I think I have many, many negative views of the decisions that were made there. But to go back to our earlier point in this conversation and the point that I've made to you many times, we're married to China. If we really want to get into an economic trade war with China and suddenly, you know, have no more ties to China, China is in control of the cards here, because if they kick Apple, Tesla, and Walmart and many other countries out of China, it's going to be devastating for the U.S. economy. So we're just going to have to figure out how to deal with this, right? And so,
Hmm.
here again, we'll have to figure out, and we'll have to watch. Is President Trump, the art of the deal maker, who wrote that book, or is he, you know, a narcissistic, crazy person? My guess is that he's probably pretty smart in terms of economic deal making, and he has a lot of bluster. But we are going to have to continue to be, and so I just don't see us diverging. I do think that we're going to just have to respect that China is the number 2 economy in the world, and soon by 2032, according to OGL predictions, it will be the largest economy in the world, and we'll just have to deal with that. And then, so we're going to have to be partners, and so that's what I think is going to happen.
So does your advice change at all for businesses looking to build relationships in China, build supply chain, build manufacturing support systems? Has anything changed in the last couple weeks about how you might counsel some of your business clients?
Well, I mean, I love the question, Aubrey, and I'll take sort of 2 levels of thinking about this. One is the big clients that I've had, organizations like Apple. Again, these organizations are married. Like, China has the most sophisticated manufacturing supply chain in the world. And it's not just because of manufacturing technology. It's because they built industrial clusters that, if we want to have tariffs and force Apple and Foxconn to be in the United States, it's going to take 40 years. It's not, this is just not going to happen. Like, we are married to China. And, the fact that Foxconn is in Chennai, India doesn't mean anything, because Foxconn is just final assembly. So, like, we're deeply, deeply, deeply embedded in China, and there's no question about that. Now, the second part of this is for smaller organizations, China is a huge opportunity, right? And so one of the smaller organizations that I'm working with, deals in the space of sustainability and thinking about energy management and, certification processes. And, China's a huge opportunity here, right? And so, like, we both have the most efficient, powerful manufacturing supply chain in the world, but we also have a country that has the second most and maybe most resources in the world in wanting to take companies going global through the BRICS economy and through the Belt and Road Initiative. And so I
Mhm.
think that there's tremendous opportunity here, and we just need to be careful.
Yeah. Well, great. I mean, I think that, like we've talked about, China is strategic in its approach and is cautious about how they intervene in the rest of the world, and are strategic about that as well. And I think that it seems, the economy may be more stable because of it. And so opportunities there may be more reliable at times, because of the long history and the strategy.
And so let me just reemphasize one thing that you and I have talked about before, but I'll say it again. And, I've gotten in trouble with people in the United States for saying this, but when I've said things like China's better at capitalism than we are, people are like, how can you say a communist economy is better at capitalism than we are? But just to be clear, it's the strategic planning, right? So,
Yeah.
like, that's the thing that's so interesting, is that in the United States, yes, we're a capitalist economy and we're a full-fledged democracy, but it's messy, right? It's messy. There are places that, I was just on a call yesterday with somebody who was asking me about this whole concept of local governments as industrial firms, and, like, can't the United States do this? I'm like, sometimes, sometimes I think Mayor Kate Gallego and, the entire state of Phoenix is doing amazing things. The entire state of Arizona is doing amazing things because of the ways in which they're doing local governments as industrial firms. And, like, this is the reason TSMC is investing $500 billion in the state of Arizona. But it's 1 in 50, right? China has a much stronger approach to this because this is the culture. The culture is local governments as industrial firms. They've built that. And I just think, it'll be interesting to see who's going to win this capitalist game. I think China's going to win.
Hmm. Well, and with that said, I also want to remind you that our friends in China also caution us against mentioning China as a capitalist economy because it's not capitalist, it's a socialist market economy.
Fair enough. And thank you for reminding me of that. And I have gotten in trouble for that with our friends in China before.
Yeah. We want to keep you on the good side of everybody and both sides as you kind of navigate this you navigate two worlds and you do it very well.
Thank
Any
you.
closing thoughts? Yeah,
Well,
absolutely. Any
I want
closing
to thank
thoughts
you
for our
for
audience?
helping me navigate. Doing interviews with you is amazing. And I think that we're really trying to deliver something for both China and the United States. We're in a very complex global political economy and a complex global political system. And so, I love these conversations because they help me think these things through.
Yeah. Well, very good. Yeah, like I said, I'm always glad for the conversations because it forces me to look beyond, my own home, my own family, my own town, my own state, my own country, and to think more globally and look at what's happening in the world strategically and how that's impacting, not just me, but everybody and other economies. So I appreciate it too. Well, with that, I guess let's wrap up and we'll talk next week. We didn't get to mention our Shanghai team shared a little bit of culture with us that maybe we can talk about next week. I think I might want to challenge you to watch, I think it's Swords into Plowshares, which is a popular TV series in China. And I think we should both watch an episode and talk about it next week.
I love that idea. I'll do it.
If we can get it here. I'm not sure if we can get it in the US, but I'm sure we can figure out a way to do it. But yeah, I think we should kind of dive into some culture, watch an episode and chat at least a little bit about it.
I love it. I want it.
Okay, perfect. Okay, well, have a great day, Doug.
You too. Can